Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Work From Home Show. Shout out to all our homies, homeboys, homegirls, home trans, all the work from homers out there. I'm Naresh. Today we have Robert Spencer on the show. He is the director of Jihad Watch. He's a multiple #1 New York Times bestselling author of The Complete Infidel's Guide to the Koran, as well as The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, as well as The Truth About Muhammad, founder of the world's most intolerant religion, and the new book, Empire of God, How the Byzantines Saved Civilization. Robert Spencer, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you. I've actually been following you and your work somewhat for the last 16 years or so. You've been around for a very long time, and we don't talk much about religion on this show, but once every blue moon we have special episodes, and I would consider this to be a special episode because foreign policy and World War III isn't too far in the distance. Going back to October 7th, there was a major terrorist attack against Israel. Tell us how you got into this space of studying Islam and writing about it and becoming an expert on it.
Yeah, absolutely. This all started actually because my family is from the Ottoman Empire, the precursor of modern Turkey. My grandparents were exiled from there for declining to convert to Islam in the waning years of the empire. They were exiled and came to the United States. I, of course, knew them many years later, and my grandmother in particular would tell me about how wonderful it was over there and what a beautiful place it was and what a joyful childhood she had there. So then that would lead me to the inevitable question, why then did you leave? And then she either could not or would not tell me. Of course, I was very young and probably she didn't want to upset me at that time, but it made me curious. I thought, I'm going to have to find this out, began to study it on my own, and that led me straight into studying Islam because all of the upheaval in that region at that time, it really goes back to Islam in various ways. Began to consult for various organizations in the 90s, was asked to write a book about all this originally right after 9/11, asked by one of the groups that I've been consulting for. And then that, of course, led to more. And one thing leads to another. And 20 years have gone by, and this is all that I do.
And how old were you when your grandma told you this and you developed this interest?
Oh, I was probably about 9 or 10.
You were just a kid.
Oh, yeah. And then I read the Quran first when I was 18 in college and took a few courses, didn't concentrate on it at that time. Then began the study in earnest really in the late 80s and 90s on my own, reading the Hadith and the life of Muhammad and all of that. And that was just a matter of personal interest at that time. But as it turned out, it coalesced with geopolitical events, and so it became a matter of larger import than that.
Are you a PhD or no?
No, I'm happy to report that I am not. I have an independent academic. I don't ever use the doctor myself, so the fact is that I don't believe that the academic establishment is even able, much less willing, to study these topics honestly at this point, but has been completely corrupted by money from Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and consequently am very happy to be operating outside of the academic establishment.
So let's talk a little bit about the Quran. You said you started reading the Quran when you were 18 years old, and we're going to get to the hard questions here because I think what's happened in society, this is not recent. This is, I think, a post 9/11 phenomena where people just automatically became ignorant of Islam, the good, the bad, you name it. It was just, hey, we're just not going to touch it. Like 9/11 was bad, it was terrible, but we're just not going to talk about it. We're just not going to touch the religion side of it because it offends too many people and people's feelings get hurt. Can you specifically cite how the Quran incites hatred and violence? And I ask that question, again, that sounds like a terrible question, but there is a reason why the terrorists, and this is not debate, I don't think anyone's going to disagree with this, but there's a reason why terrorists start yelling Allahu Akbar before they crash the planes into the World Trade Center, before they go on a stabbing spree, or while running over people on the streets in parts of Europe. So they're doing it in Allah's God. So they're clearly doing it in the name of God because of something that they were taught or something that they read. So can you specifically cite how the Quran incites hatred and violence?
Oh, sure. I can make a distinction in the first place between the Quran and Muslims. And the fact that the Quran does indeed incite hatred and violence doesn't mean that every Muslim is hateful and violent. Just as the Christian New Testament says, love your enemies and turn the other cheek, but that doesn't mean that every Christian loves his enemies or turns the other cheek. The teachings of the religion are one thing. The people who adhere to the religion are quite another. They may have a variety of influences. This is a point I've made millions of times over the years, but it still seems to, I think, maybe purposefully elude the grasp of many people who insist that to criticize the Quran or Islam is somehow to denigrate all Muslims. And there's just no logical reason why that should be so, or why that follows at all. But it needs to be clarified because it is so often insisted. Now, as for the Quran is unique among the holy books of the world in having a developed doctrine and theology and legal system arising from it that calls for violence against unbelievers, sanctifies violence against unbelievers, justifies the violence, considers it a blessed act, a holy act, and this is why you have so many Islamic jihadis. It's not rocket science, really. It's quite.
Before you move on, though, can you define, because there are a lot of terms that you're using here which sound reasonable and commonsensical, but what is your definition of, or what is the Quran's definition of, I guess, violence? Like, do they mean going and punching someone in the face, or do they mean, like, does it say somewhere, hey, go blow up buildings? Like,
the Quran in 3 places says, kill them wherever you find them. That's chapter 2, verse 191, chapter 4, verse 89, and then chapter 9, verse 5 says, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. And gotcha. So there's that. Then chapter 47, verse 4 says, when you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks. And chapter 8, verse 12 says that the Lord commanded the angels, strike the necks of the unbelievers and strike their fingertips. And then you have the general command in chapter 5, verse 33, that those who make war against Allah and his messengers should be killed or crucified, and their hands and feet cut off on opposite sides. That is, one hand and one foot, your left hand and right foot, or your right hand and left foot. And so you have very clear exhortations to physical violence that you would have to interpret in a highly symbolic manner to get away from the literal impact of them as clearly calling for physical activity. You don't, for example, also you have chapter 8, verse 41, which says that when you are fighting the unbelievers in war and you take their property and their women as spoils of war, then you have to give a fifth to the messenger of Allah, that is to Muhammad. And so if you're talking about jihad as a spiritual struggle, there are no spoils of war in a spiritual struggle. If I sit down and pray all day, there's not going to be booty arising from that, the spoils of war. But if I go out and raid the unbelievers and carry away their property and the wives of the warriors I've killed, well, that's obviously the spoils of war. So the Quran is very clearly and unmistakably referring to physical warfare and violence. And so you have also perhaps the crowning of all these verses, among many others, is chapter 9, verse 111, which guarantees a place in paradise to those who kill and are killed for Allah. They fight in the way of Allah, they kill and are killed. And obviously, if you're thinking about all this in a spiritual way, it's hard to imagine a scenario in which you would be killed, much less in which you would be killing. So I don't think there's really any dispute among people who are informed and honest. And of course, both of those are at a premium these days. But anybody who is informed and honest has to acknowledge that the Quran calls for physical violence against people who are not Muslim.
I think anyone who's been alive for at least 25 years can agree with that without a doubt. And like you said, how you preface this conversation, this does not mean all Muslims are terrorists. This does not mean Muslims are bad people. In fact, the Muslims here in America, I would say 99.9 repeating percent of them are well vetted, good human beings. Many of them people who I know, my friends, and it is that really small statistic that ends up becoming 9/11 or Orlando shooter or guy who goes into the mall and starts stabbing people, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd put the percentage as high as you would, but of course nobody really knows because there's a lot of fluidity. For example, you can have people who are not religious, not devout, not paying any attention to what's written in the book, and then because of some crisis in their life or some turning point, they turn to their religion and become violent. There are many examples of that. There was a man on the campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill back in 2006. His name was Mohammad Reza Tahiri Azhar. He was of Iranian descent, and he was a secular Muslim, didn't pay any attention to Islam, and was living the life that college students all too often live nowadays in America. But at a certain point, he woke up to how empty that life was and how unfulfilling he was in just pursuing hedonistic pleasure and so on. And so he had a kind of conversion experience and became more devout in his study of Islam and began to undertake a systematic study of the Quran, in which he took extensive notes that he ultimately, after he tried to kill people on campus, running them down with an SUV he had rented, he didn't manage to kill anyone, but he did injure 9 students. He sent a number of letters to the campus newspaper, which contained a very detailed exposition of the Quran, explaining how it had motivated him to do all this. And so I think that is an indication of the dangers of what we're dealing with, really, that even people that we might have counted on as being completely benign and moderate can be susceptible to this appeal, since it is grounded in religious obligations.
That's quite ironic because I went to Duke for graduate school, which is right down the street from University of North Carolina, UNC Chapel Hill. You also did your master's at UNC Chapel Hill. And while I was at Duke, there was a student, this didn't make the news or anything, but I was somewhat involved in this because there was a student, very similar story. It was a woman, though, a young female who was a student there at UNC, and she was just a regular student, just, college student, going to class, having a good time. And then I don't know all the details, but I'm assuming, or I'm not assuming, I do know there were some family issues, some troubles, financial, you name it. and the Muslim Student Association, the MSA, funded trips somewhere during the summers. I don't know where, but somewhere in the Middle East, I'm assuming. And so she took one of these like MSA trips to, it was just like a 8-week thing, I think, like a 6 to 8 week course or something abroad. And she came back a completely changed person. Like her friends didn't even recognize her. She was wearing different clothing. She was acting differently. She started cutting out a lot of friends. And then she just went like crazy. And how I got involved was I had to pick up her car from a gas station because she abducted somebody at another gas station, and drove across North Carolina, ended up in Durham. And how do I know this? Because of my roommate at the time. He was friends with her brother, and he was like, "Hey, I need your help. I need somebody who lives in the area to go pick up this minivan and hold on to this minivan for about a week until we figure out what to do." And I was the guy who was tasked with doing that. And so my roommate told me the whole story, and I was just like, this is wild. And that's how this was a very mild case of brainwashing. But what you said is much more severe and major, hopping into an SUV and trying to run students over.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are many, many stories like that. And in some cases, they mislead people. As a matter of fact, 9/11 is one of those stories, because sometimes you come across the statement that the 9/11 hijackers were seen, at least some of them, at a strip club not long before the attack. And some people have argued on that basis, see, these people, they were not serious Muslims, because a devout Muslim wouldn't go to a place like that. And they fail to understand that the people who were engaging in this were thinking of it as being a supreme act of jihad. And there is nothing greater, according to Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, than waging jihad. And so they kind of thought that they had a free pass. That, in other words, anything that they might have done in the lead up to the 9/11 attacks, in terms of sin in Islam, would be washed away by the 9/11 attack as this great act of jihad. And so they could act in a way that would appear to be un-Islamic while being fully Islamic and not seeing any inconsistency. Also, there was an attack, a very serious attack, I believe it was in France a few years back, and the same thing. The guy had been seen, he was a big drinker and all sorts of things that are against Islam, and so people were saying he's not a real Muslim, but actually it was because he had been engaging in this behavior that he undertook. He felt repentant and decided that he had to go on jihad to make up for how he had been acting.
I like how previously you were able to cite the exact places of where we can find stuff in the Quran, because many of the listeners, they may call you all sorts of names, but once you start citing, and that's why I myself am a commentator. I get asked to go on TV once in a while, and citing is really the key to winning arguments and debates. Can you cite how the Quran is anti-democratic, anti-freedom, and intolerant of any other ideology?
Well, certainly in chapter 3, verse 85, it says that no other religion will be acceptable before Allah. And so the idea that Islam is tolerant and peaceful, when you have that combined with chapter 8, verse 39, it kind of gives the lie to that. Chapter 8, verse 39 says, fight them until persecution is no more and religion is all for Allah. Now, if you're fighting them until persecution is no more, then that can be understood as a defensive conflict. And no problem, self-defense is something that's pretty much universally recognized in cultures around the world. But then it doesn't stop there and goes on to say, and religion is all for Allah. And so you fight them until religion is all for Allah. That's essentially an open-ended declaration of war for all time against people who are just minding their own business, not doing anything except that their religion is not all for Allah. And so no other religion will be acceptable before Allah. And so the Muslims have the responsibility to fight to stamp out the observance of those other religions, or to subjugate those people under the hegemony of Islam, as is called for in chapter 9, verse 29, which says, fight against those who do not believe in Allah in the last day, do not obey Allah and his messenger, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued, even if they are of the people of the book, which is primarily Jews and Christians. So the idea is to fight the Jews and Christians until they pay the jizya, this tax, and they submit. Now, you asked, how is the Quran anti-democratic? Well, one of the foremost ideas in democratic societies is the equality of rights of all people before the law. But the Quran directly contradicts that with saying that you should fight against the people of the book until they pay this tax and feel themselves subdued, that is, submit to the Muslims. Then obviously they're not on the same level as the Muslims, they're submitting to them. And then chapter 48, verse 29 says, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are ruthless to unbelievers, merciful to one another. Now, here again, you can't have a whole class of people that you're actually told as part of your religious observance to be ruthless toward, and then think that you are somehow being democratic and ensuring the equality of rights of all people. You either got one or the other, but you can't have both.
So you're saying that persecution is worse than slaughter. So that's why it's better to just kill everyone off, all the infidels off, rather than trying to rule over them or colonize them or treat people as slaves. Just kill them, just slaughter them.
Actually, no. The Quran actually says just the opposite. That in chapter 9, verse 29 that I was just quoting, that there is provided the idea of the submission of the unbelievers, that they can pay the tax and they accept various other discriminatory and humiliating regulations, and then they're allowed to practice their religion without interference, although that's really always a tenuous thing, and they're subjected to, in practice, they've been subjected to harassment and all sorts of deprivations throughout Islamic history. But yeah, that allows for a tripartite choice for, at very least, for the people of the book, that is primarily the Jews and Christians, as well as Zoroastrians and some others. You have the idea that they can convert to Islam, or submit and pay the tax and accept the rest of the discrimination, or be killed, go to war. And those are the three choices. So it's not just kill them all by any means. Even the Hindus, who, according to classic Islamic theology, are not the people of the book, and thus they must indeed be converted to Islam or killed, without the intermediate possibility of submission. They were given very early in the Islamic conquest of India, starting in the 7th century, given a kind of honorary people of the book status, because there were just too many for them all to be converted or killed. And so they too were allowed to submit and pay the jizya, although this was not something that was specifically warranted in the Quran itself.
Well, I'm a Hindu myself, fully practicing, and most Hindus don't fully understand. Maybe it's leftist media. Leftist media isn't just in the United States. It's rampant in India. And I can tell you, I've visited Humayun's tomb. I've read about the Muslim conquest. First off, and maybe please correct me if my sourcing is wrong, but the latest statistic I read is that more than 16 million people worldwide, not 16 million, it's more than 11% of the global population is descended from Genghis Khan during his conquest, or the Muslim conquest. So that's a lot of people that this man really ended up impregnating, to put it nicely, raping, to have children. And in the case of India, India was ruled by the Muslims for centuries upon centuries. Started, at least to my record, or to records, started with, was it Babur, and then Humayun after that. And I bring this up because people talk about the Holocaust of the Jews during the 1930s mostly, but there was a huge Holocaust of Hindu Indians in India that lasted for centuries, really, during Muslim rule. It's estimated that somewhere between 70 to 90 million Indian Hindus were killed, women were raped, women were used, men were burned at the stake, they were beheaded. So this was a huge atrocity, and they tried to wipe Hindus off the map. Of course, they're trying to wipe Israel off the map right now, but they tried to wipe India off the map and Hindus off the map. So if you can, feel free to correct me for anything that I said that was wrong, but that's just an important part of our history that people just don't care to talk about, which I'm okay with, because it's, hey, we live in the 21st century, especially if you're in America. Let's focus on today. I get that, but you can't claim that you're for something like the BLM movement and reparations and all this stuff without understanding your own history, which is what so many leftists focus on.
Yeah, you're quite right. This is absolutely true. Most Americans, most people in the West have no idea of the jihad against India. I tried to correct that to some degree myself when I wrote the book, The History of Jihad, in 2018. As far as I know, it's the first in-depth history of jihad that included the jihad against India, which has been left out of other histories of jihad that have been published in the West. And I think most Americans would be absolutely shocked by the full extent and the magnitude and the sheer brutality of the jihad against India, which was worse, actually, than the jihad against Europe and against the West in general, precisely because the Hindus were not people of the book. And even though they were accorded the status in a kind of an accommodation, that did not mitigate the sheer brutality of the jihad against the Indian population, because they were considered to be on a lower plane than the people that the Muslims were fighting in Europe, who had what the Muslims considered to be authentic revelations from God, although they had allegedly tampered with them. And so the Hindu temples were demolished all over the country and mosques built over the ruins. This is something that now is just coming to light in India and causing a lot of controversy. People are calling for some of those mosques to be torn down and the temples rebuilt. And of course, the Muslim population is very upset about that. And in history, the statues, the idols that were in the Hindu temples were actually broken into pieces, and the pieces put in front of the mosques so that the Muslims would be walking over the gods of the Hindus as they walked in and out of the mosques. And so the brutality, the cruelty of this was matched by the brutality against the people. And as you noted, most people have no idea of this and no idea of its implications, and above all, no idea of the fact that Islamic theology has not changed since the Muslim jihad against India, that there are many Muslim groups still waging that jihad. The Indian nation is still threatened by Islamic jihadis, as we saw with the November 26th massacre in Mumbai some years ago. And the thing is, it's the same ideology as is held by Hamas that just struck against Israel, and is held by the 9/11 hijackers who hit the United States 22 years ago now. And people have no idea in general of the fact that this is all the same group. And even though you have ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Hamas and Boko Haram and the Pakistani Taliban and then the Taliban in Afghanistan and all the other jihad groups, they all ultimately have the same motives, the same goals, the same beliefs. They're just variations on the same theme.
We see people on the streets right now, a lot of LGBTQ members, women, feminists going out with their Palestinian flags saying Free Palestine from the river to the sea. Can you tell us a little bit more about how, again, you can cite the Quran. How does the Quran sanction domestic abuse, honor killing? What does it say about homosexuals and women's rights?
Well, the Quran...
And explain honor killing, too, because I'm sure a lot of people don't know what that is.
Okay, well, honor killing is the idea of cleansing the honor of the family after generally a sexual indiscretion, usually by a daughter, sometimes by a wife. The nature of the indiscretion can be something like, on the part of a wife, just wanting a divorce from an abusive or cruel or indifferent husband. And some women have been murdered on that basis. This is based on a passage in the Quran, a very strange passage in chapter 18, where Moses, the prophet from the Jewish scriptures, Moses is walking along with an unnamed person whom he clearly respects a great deal. And the unnamed person, who is known as Khidr or Green in Islamic tradition, he tells Moses he can go along with him, walk along with him, as long as he doesn't ask any questions. And the strange figure proceeds to do a lot of odd things that make Moses break his promise and ask some questions. And so finally the guy says, okay, I've had enough. You keep asking questions and I'm not going to walk around with you anymore, but I will answer your questions. And one of them was about a young man that they came upon that this strange figure, Khidr, he killed. There's just this boy going along with his life and he's killed. And so Moses says, why did you kill this boy? And he says, I could tell that he was going to grow up to be an unbeliever. And his parents are very pious. They deserved better. So I killed him and they can have another child. And so the idea of killing a wayward child is justified in the core text of Islam. And so that's the justification for honor killing. Many Muslim countries have relaxed penalties. If you can prove that if you commit a murder, but you can prove that it was committed for honor, then you get a lesser penalty than you would if it's just an ordinary murder. And so this is a very insidious idea, but it's very deeply rooted in Islamic culture. Honor killings are rampant in places like Pakistan, but not just there. Unfortunately, we've even seen honor killings in the United States. There was one in Texas some years ago. A Muslim from Egypt murdered his two daughters on New Year's Day, I believe it was 2009, and he did so because they had non-Muslim boyfriends. And so he considered that they had sullied the honor of the family and deserved to be killed to cleanse that honor.
Okay, does this apply? Do honor killings apply to everyone within that nation? So let's say like Saudi Arabia, for example. I'm not sure if honor killings are around there, but you have so many like people like Americans who live in Saudi Arabia, Indians who live in Saudi Arabia because maybe they work in the oil and gas industry. So would this apply to them also, even if they're not like Saudi Arabian citizens or Muslims?
Generally, no. Generally, an honor killing takes place within the family. It's the father and the brothers who are killing the daughter or the wife. And yes, there are many, I have many instances of this noted at jihadwatch.org. The brothers or the the sons of a woman participating with the husband or father in her murder because they think that she has transgressed against Islam in some way. And so, yeah, I'm sure that it happens in Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is a very closed society. And as it's likely that a lot of this would not be considered to be a crime at all, it's not generally reported. It's just like spousal abuse. That was another thing that you mentioned. And the thing about spousal abuse is that the Quran in chapter 4, verse 34 allows for a man to beat a woman from whom he fears disobedience. So, in other words, it's not even that she's disobedient. He's just afraid that she might become disobedient. And on that basis, he can beat her. And so that being the case, it being something that's accepted in the Quran, you're not going to find news about rates of domestic abuse in Muslim countries because it's just not considered to be a crime. And so you try to go to Pakistan and say, hey, how many battered women do you have in Pakistan? How many women are beaten? They would laugh at you because it happens all the time. And there's nothing done because it's not.
Well, they probably wouldn't be able to. They would be like, what? What does that even mean? Like,
yeah. Yeah, actually, yeah, I can give you an example just from a few days ago. There was a journalist who went to Afghanistan, a female journalist, and she is asking in this video that was circulating on Twitter, and I put it at Jihad Watch, she was asking these Taliban guys in Afghanistan, what about abused women? What can they do in Afghanistan? And the guy talking to her says, there are no abused women. We don't have an abuse problem in Afghanistan. This is something that is just propaganda against the Taliban state, this Taliban regime. And if a man has a disobedient woman, he can beat her. He should beat her. And the guy didn't see any irony in what he was saying. He did not consider the beating that is sanctioned in the Quran to be abuse. And so, of course, there's no abuse of women in Afghanistan. And yes, of course, women are beaten. And he didn't see any problem with this at all because it comes from Allah.
Let's talk a little bit because this has become really popular. It became popular a few years after 9/11, and it's becoming popular now. Popular in the sense of it's sexually related. Can you talk a little bit about this X-rated paradise where men can go after committing, let's say, a terrorist attack or doing something in the name of Allah and getting 72 virgins? Like, what is this all about?
Yeah, well, the Quran actually describes in several passages the delights that await the blessed, and the paradise is pictured as this wonderful garden where everything good is in the garden, and one of the things that you get in the garden are women. And so, for example, in chapter 78 of the Quran, in it's verses 32 and following, 31 start with, indeed, for the righteous is achievement, enclosed gardens and vineyards, and large-breasted women of equal age, And so who are these large-breasted women? Well, there is a hadith, a tradition of Muhammad, that says that you get these 72 women, and 72 of them are these heavenly women, huris they are called, who exist really for the pleasure of the Muslim men. And then the 70 others are actually women who've been condemned to hell, but they're working off their hell by essentially being prostitutes for the Muslim men in paradise. And so that is what a lot of Muslim men actually think they're going to get in paradise, because after all, it's in the Quran, and then Muhammad says it. And there are many other traditions that add to this idea. And so it's very common. I remember a few years back, there was a kid, teenage boy, and he strapped a bomb onto himself, and he was a Palestinian. He was going into Israel, and he was caught. And the Israelis had this robot, this thing that came up and disarmed him, so that nobody had to go and try to get the bomb off him and get blown up in the process. And so this machine is disarming this kid, and he's standing there in his underwear because it had to undress him to get to the bomb. And he says, "How am I going to get to paradise and get my virgins now?" But this is something that's in the popular imagination. And you can imagine when you have very sexually anxious teenage boys, this is going to be a very attractive idea to them. And
I don't even think you have to be a teenage boy. I think there are many other men who would find this attractive. Yeah. So let's talk. I want to shift to what happened on October 7th. And before we do that, Jews, are they singled out within the Quran, or are there other religions singled out within the Quran? Because it seems like the Jews are the focus of Muslim conquests overall, the vitriol and hatred.
Yeah, definitely. For the Jews, it's worse. You could say also that for the Jews and the Hindus, it's worse. And that actually is consistent with what we see historically. As I noted a few minutes ago, the jihad against India has been especially bloody and especially cruel. Also, then you have the jihad against the Jews, which has been particularly relentless and particularly unsusceptible to any kind of mitigation. And this goes back to chapter 5, verse 82 of the Quran, which says, "You will find the Jews and the idolaters the most vehement of mankind in hostility to those who believe." So if the Jews and the idolaters are the most vehement in mankind, among mankind, in hostility to those who believe, then what that works out to in practice is that the Muslims are most hostile to the Jews and the idolaters.
Are the idolaters, would that be people who pray to idols? Is that what they're saying? Because Hinduism is, to my knowledge, the largest religion of people praying to idols.
Yeah, exactly. And so the idea I believe that the word here is mushrikeen, which is the people who practice shirk. And shirk is the worst sin in Islam. It's associating partners with Allah in worship. And so if you worship not just Allah, but someone else as well, then that is shirk, and then you are a mushrik or mushrikeen in the plural, and those are the worst enemies of the Muslims, along with the Jews. So the Hindus, of course, are guilty of shirk because of the many gods of Hinduism, and consequently, they, along with the Jews, are considered to be the most hostile people to the Muslims, which makes the Muslims the most hostile people to them.
LGBTQ, homosexuality, what does the Quran, maybe you can cite some stuff here, what does the Quran say about all of that? Because I find it outlandish that so many LGBTQIA+, whatever you want to call them, they're going out protesting, like I said, pro-Palestine, they've never visited. It's like they obviously have never visited, and it's like they know nothing about these countries and the religion, because these are the first people who would probably be beheaded.
Yeah, they have no clue. It's incredible to me the level of willful ignorance in this regard. The governing idea here is actually from a hadith, in this case, in which Muhammad says those who commit the sin of Lot, and that is going back to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And there's a passage in Genesis where the people of Sodom come and a couple of visitors come to visit Lot. I believe they're angels, as a matter of fact. I'm not sure I remember that right, but in any case, the people of Sodom come and pound on the door and say, "Bring out the men who are visiting you so that we may know them," that is, have sexual relations with them. And so this is why homosexual activity is known as sodomy in the West, and it all comes from that. Muhammad says the people who commit the sin of Lot, kill them, kill both the one who is done and the one who is having it done to him. And so his statement is unequivocal in that regard. And so as a result, the death penalty for homosexuality is very common in Muslim countries. You find, as a matter of fact, I think all or most of the countries that still criminalize homosexuality at all, and certainly those that have a death penalty for it, are Muslim countries because of what Muhammad says. And so the idea that Islam is somehow compatible with homosexuality or compatible with the LGBTQ movement, this is sheer fantasy on the part of these people. And if Queers for Palestine were to go to Palestine, they would be killed without any hesitation. And as a matter of fact, there was a Muslim cleric in Gaza not long ago who was saying, I'm hearing about these people. We don't want their support. And what they're doing is an abomination. And so I don't know how it is that the Queers for Palestine are ignoring all this and ignoring the universal testimony of Islamic law, Islamic history, contemporary practice, but somehow they've missed it all and have convinced themselves that they should stand with the Palestinians instead of with Israel, which is the only country in the Middle East that actually has a gay pride parade and all that business, and does not have any opprobrium on homosexual activity. So really, if these leftists were consistent, they would be supporting Israel. But there's a tremendous contradiction that they seem to have no problem in maintaining.
October 7th, let's get to this. The biggest question I have is, how did this even happen? Like, Israel, I know quite a bit about Israel. I grew up with a ton of Jews in Houston, went to school with a lot of Jews. I mean, I was like an honorary Jew, always at the Jewish frat houses. My roommates were Jewish, and I learned a lot about the religion, about the culture, about Israel. I've never visited, but Israel has one of the best militaries in the world because it's mandatory that you serve in the military, and that's what you can attribute the leadership, the innovation, to the fact that everyone has to serve in the military. They're cybersecurity experts. They outsource. They make cybersecurity technology, outsource it around the world. The United States even uses a lot of Israeli products. They were even bringing in Israeli scientists to FDA meetings during the pandemic and having the scientists explain even more than what U.S. scientists were able to explain, stuff on the vaccines, about the Wuhan virus, CCP virus, whatever you want to call it. So how on earth did this terrorist attack on October 7th happen against Israel? I just find this to be a lot of different things. I just can't believe it happened in Israel.
Well, two things. One, they underestimated Hamas, and two, they believed Hamas. In the first place, Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, he forbade lying, except in the case of a husband and a wife. He said a husband can lie to his wife to keep the peace in the marriage, and he said that lying was allowed in wartime. And as a matter of fact, he said, war is deceit. War is deceit. And so Hamas told Israel that they were too busy governing Gaza to worry about jihad warfare against the Israelis. And so the Israelis believed them. And as a result, they actually took forces away from the Gaza border and moved them over to the West Bank, where there was some unrest at the time, not long before the attack. And so this was believing Hamas when they should have been more mindful of the possibility that they were being deceived. And then, secondly, they underestimated Hamas. It's just recently come to light that a full report was given to Israeli intelligence officials some time ago, I think last year even. A full report was given to them about what Hamas was planning. And it was a fairly detailed exposition of actually what they did on October 7th. But the Israelis did not believe that Hamas was capable of pulling it off. And so they didn't pay the report any attention. And so the two of those things, they underestimated Hamas and they believed Hamas. And, well, we all know the result.
So last question, and then we'll wrap this up. What does all of this mean for America? Do you think with the open borders that the U.S. is at risk? Do you think there are currently jihadists, terrorists, Islamists within the United States? Is this something that Americans listening to this episode right now should be worried about right now?
Oh, yeah. I don't have any doubt. For example, over the past year, with the southern border being open, there were 659 people on the terror watch list apprehended at the border. Now, the thing about that is that's just the people who got caught. We don't know how many people got through without being caught. With the border open, there's just no doubt that the jihadis have been paying attention and taking advantage as much as they possibly could. And so it's a very dangerous situation. We have an unknowable number of jihadis in the country now, and they may just be biding their time before deciding to strike.
Okay, well, Robert Spencer, thank you so much for joining us on the Work From Home show. You're the director of Jihad Watch. The website is jihadwatch.org. That's jihadwatch.org, G-I-H-A-D, watch.org. #1 New York Times bestselling author of multiple books. Just type in Robert Spencer on Amazon and you'll see all the different books that are available there. Robert, any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners or anything else you want to promote?
I do have this a new book called Empire of God, How the Byzantines Saved Civilization, which is about a nation that has a lot of lessons that we could learn, particularly, for example, in how to resist jihad, which they did successfully for nearly 800 years. And so that's available now at Amazon and wherever good books are sold. Empire of God, How the Byzantines Saved Civilization.
That sounds good. Robert Spencer, thank you so much once again for joining us. To all our listeners, check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. That's www.workfromhomeshow.com. Get on our mailing list there. Follow us on social media. We're on X. We're on Facebook. If you have any questions, if you were offended by this interview, comments, anything, email us, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's hello@workfromhomeshow.com. I found this interview very valuable. It's something I'm going to reference throughout my lifetime. My kids are going to reference it throughout their life, or I'll at least tell them about it. There's just a lot of timeless information here. So thank you so much for joining us. And until next week, keep on working from home. All right, Robert, thanks for that. That was really good.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. It's nice to be able to go into that much depth. And so thank you.
Yep. So we're actually going to post it within the next half hour. So you'll see it tagged on your social media.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
See you later.